I got into this with one of my buddies from grad school recently because he's kind of a thespian. And I was saying, I feel like I don't get this art thing that we were talking about. And he said something to the effect of like, well, it's not for you to understand. And it gave me a lot of pause for a second. I was like, well, what do you mean it's not for me to understand? Am I not the recipient of this art? And I just don't understand it. And then he kind of doubled down. He's like, well, it's not the artist's responsibility to be understood. And it really stuck with me because I feel like that's a really good example of how our mentality, that third reason why, can really harangue us. I believe this very strongly, and that's that it is 99.999% the responsibility of the communicator to be understood. That you have to be, reaching out as far as you possibly can, so that your audience only has to go like this. And for those of us that are in practice, there's a good reason for that, because we are trying to sell a lot of times, people on our findings to say, we really want you to buy into this.
Have you ever sat through or even given a presentation that was completely correct and completely forgettable? Somewhere between the data and the decision, something gets lost. And it's not because the research is bad or that the data is wrong. It's likely because nobody built a bridge to make it land. And if you've ever walked out of a meeting wondering why a good idea, backed by good evidence, still didn't move anything, you already know how expensive that gap can be. Welcome to the Science for Work podcast, where we explore evidence-based insights from IO psychology and HR management to help make work better. I'm your host, Matt Lampe. Our guest today is AJ Thurston. AJ is the Chief of Market Research for Military Recruiting within the DoD Office of People Analytics and a professor of IO psychology at George Mason University. This gives him a rare view into both the research and the practice sides of data communication. In this conversation, we get into what actually makes data communication effective. Simple language, honest visuals, and structures that stick with an audience long after the meeting ends. We also talk about who really carries the responsibility to be understood. AJ gets into why good research doesn't always change minds and what we can do about it. AJ, welcome to the Science for Work podcast. It's good to have you here.
Hey, thanks, Matt. It's great to be here.
So before we get into any of the conversation today, is there anything that you would want to kind of state for the record about today's conversation before we jump into it?
Yeah, I do have a little disclaimer. Any opinions or statements expressed do not express the position of the United States government or the United States Department of War.
Excellent. Good to make sure we get that in there. So, let's talk about that a little bit. Why that disclaimer is there? Tell us a little bit about who you are and the kind of work that you do.
Yeah, sure. Gladly. So I currently am the Chief of Market Research for the Office of People Analytics within the Pentagon, where we focus on recruiting. I am also a professor of IO psychology within the Masters of Professional Studies program at George Mason, which is a fantastic program. So I have a little bit of foot in both the practitioner side and also still trying my best to hold on to the academic side as well.
Yeah, you definitely have a lot going on. That's awesome. And it's great to be able to have the conversation with somebody who can see both the research and the theory side, and then also what does it actually look like in practice when it's being put to use. So let's talk about that a little bit. When we were talking about what to cover in the episode, what to explore was a little bit more around data communication and how to be more effective communicating data. Let's talk about data visualization for a second. How does that show up in your everyday, and where do you see it being utilized or more opportunities?
Gladly. Yeah. I think, as I've kind of got to one foot in each of these camps, I've definitely realized that really no matter who you're talking to, you can always be a more effective data communicator, and both audiences really appreciate it. And the cool thing is when you get better at talking to one, you also get better at talking to the other. But what I found is that we're really well trained on things like written communication. And I think a lot of us are good at oral communication. But I think a really big afterthought in terms of like when you look at like the PsyOp education and training guidelines, no shade on those folks. One of my colleagues actually helped refresh those recently, and I think they're really good. But I do think that it does state that we need the skill in visual communication as well. And unfortunately, I think a lot of academics think of that as almost an afterthought. Like when they're trying to present the research, they're very focused on what are the words that I wrote. Everybody will understand those because we're really practiced at talking to other academics. And then, you kind of get a kind of hand waving motion towards the verbal communication, right? You're going to do a job talk and you'll go present at PsyOp and you'll stand in front of your poster. But that's a lot less formal. And then what you actually like put on, your slides or how you actually communicate data in a way that any audience can understand. I don't even think is really an afterthought for most. It's kind of like a given. And I think nowadays, especially, a lot of folks have kind of come to that realization of there's a lot of folks in data science or in other fields, especially with kind of computer scientists and AI development, use a lot of the same terminology that biopsychologists are very comfortable with, but they do so in a little bit more of a compelling way just because they're so practiced at talking to non-technical audiences in particular. So I'm hoping we can kind of get into that, and then also just talk about effective communication more broadly.
So a couple thoughts as you're sharing. I've heard, and I can even vouch for it as my experience. Sometimes there's a lot of the written content that can be put together to present a really compelling case with data. But for the non-technical audience or for the non-IO psychology based group, they want pictures. They want to see something. They want a quick TLDR. So when it comes to some of the skills and some of the training around that, I mean, I don't remember getting a lot of that sort of education in my grad school courses. It was sort of, like you said, almost an afterthought kind of being added on. So I'm curious, is that still the case? And then in your experience, both in the classroom, but then also out in the workforce and out in the field, does that translate as well?
Well, I mean, I can speak for Mason since I specifically work there. And I will say that like in the program that I'm in particular, but kind of across the whole program, like, no, I think we're actually doing something very special. And that's that students are really well prepared to have those discussions. And then in terms of kind of in practice, I think it's still kind of not, I wouldn't say this the Wild West, but it's definitely not locked in. It's somewhere in between. And I think, you made a great point there about we really need to focus to get into the how of how to be more effective. You kind of have to understand the why. And the why really is, when we're framing a discussion, we're very comfortable at talking about relationships. We really do kind of focus on facts. I love that phrase that like facts tell and stories sell. And that's so true because, your visuals are going to help communicate that story. But I'm kind of a weirdo. In modern times, everybody's all about data storytelling. To be honest, data storytelling feels a little bit too whimsical for me. I just am not all that comfortable focusing on that. But I still do think that you can tell an effective story with data. And then the other kind of piece to this why is that I think a lot of folks, and I'll just speak for myself. When I first started, I thought, the data do kind of speak for themselves. I can present this correlation matrix and everybody will be so impressed by the fact that they're, statistically significant and of practical relevance. And nobody is. And I would argue that even other academics are sometimes not even impressed by that, most of the time because they're trying to like critique it, right? And so I think there's a lot of the other kind of third piece of this in terms of why is I think folks have a misunderstanding of where like the allocation of the responsibility falls. I got into this with one of my buddies from grad school recently because he's kind of a thespian. And I was saying, I feel like I don't get this art thing that we were talking about. And he said something to the effect of like, well, it's not for you to understand. And gave me a lot of pause for a second. I was like, well, what do you mean it's not for me to understand? Am I not the recipient of this art? You know, and I just don't understand it. And then he kind of doubled down. He's like, well, it's not the artist's responsibility to be understood. And it really stuck with me because I feel like that's a really good example of how our mentality, that third and why, can really harangue us. I believe this very strongly, and that's that it is 99.999% the responsibility of the communicator to be understood. That you have to be, reaching out as far as you possibly can, so that your audience only has to go like this. And for those of us that are in practice, there's a good reason for that, because we are trying to sell a lot of times, people on our findings to say, we really want you to buy into this. And I think academics get really comfortable. And again, I don't just want to throw shade on academics, but I think there's a mentality out there. I won't say it's a specific domain, but there's a mentality out there of, well, I need to be understood. Well, no, you have to build understanding. And I think a lot of times that is just getting a little bit more comfortable with, using tools to create effective visual communication. Also, I think another thing that I think is really effective for academics in particular is to get a little bit more comfortable with stepping out of your comfort zone when it comes to like inferring causality, or taking a quantile of what a continuous variable. I think there's a lot of explicit no-nos, some sacred cows out there that folks are not willing to kind of give up, but it is at the expense of effective understanding. And so I think those are kind of the big key pieces. So if there's a mentality of, how far do I have to reach out? There's kind of the priority, and then there's just a level of comfort, right? So I have always been taught to do it this way, and if I do it, I will be successful. And the only constant really is change. So nowadays, you do have to be a little bit more effective at putting out results that can be easily understood.
Yeah. And I don't think that there's any shade being thrown. It's highlighting an opportunity or a gap where there's tremendous skill that is built around how to write up very scientific, very rigorous, very detailed information and share it out. And there's a tremendous opportunity to be able to connect that to, did it actually motivate an action or a strategy or any sort of implementation? If not, that's great that you were able to do that. But if all it does is sit on a shelf, there's a big kind of question mark that does what comes along with that. And, a couple things that I've shared before on the podcast. So regular listeners, apologize, you're going to hear this again. The meaning of your communication is the result you're getting. And so the way that I interpret that, part of that is there is a responsibility on your end, on the communicator's end, like you're saying, to be able to understand, how is this message landing? I can think of situations where the same message is delivered multiple times and it doesn't land, then all of a sudden it does. And kind of understanding as the communicator, as the person that's done the academic rigor, the data, the science, the research behind it, understanding, okay, what was different about this time? Being able to look at the context around and saying, these pieces over here changed, that all of a sudden my message, which was the same message, the same data, it's now landing differently because of X, Y, and Z. Being able to understand that and recognize that has the potential to increase the extent to which your data is utilized. Any thoughts around that?
No, 100%. And actually, you made me think of another quote that I recently heard. A very handsome bearded fellow with glasses once said, "It's not who you know, it's not what you know, it's who knows what you know." And that has really stuck with me, because that is a really good way of kind of encapsulating all of that. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. You can have the best ideas, but if you don't communicate them clearly, and also you're really good at communicating. I don't know an academic IO psychologist or practitioner-focused IO psychologist from a reputable program that isn't an effective written communicator. I think they do a fantastic job. There's a reason that we exist and are in demand. But yeah, it's just like one level, just one click further that you can go that really does drive a lot of results. One thing that I was thinking kind of as we were talking about this, why, is, there's a lot of hows out there. How can you be more effective?
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe it's just, Matt, I'm sure you can relate being an academic. The academic in me is like, okay, but what does it actually mean? Because people will say things like, so let's actually get into like how you actually get more effective. Everybody knows KISS, keep it simple, stupid, right? And usually the discussion in terms of like how to be more effective ends with those 4 words. And then nobody tells you kind of, oh, you're like, okay, keep it simple, stupid, got it. Okay. How can I make it more simple? How can I, and also not reduce the effectiveness of what I'm trying to say in order to, actually get my point across. I do need to be able to deliver the insight. So how do you do that? And I think the first thing I tell folks is, you can, in terms of like the target, you have to have a clear target for how simple you want things to be. And people are way too conservative about how simple they can make things. I think because being academics, we really do have complicated language. Like when we say a word like job performance, that is a specific construct. It has real meaning and it has specific measures. When I say the theory of planned behavior, that is like a little secret passphrase between you and I that means a whole lot of things. We're talking about careers, we're talking about distal and proximal predictors. But when non-academics or just non-technical audiences, non-IOs, hear those phrases, you feel like you have to spell it out for them. But what I always tell my students is the great thing about IO psychology is like a lot of the words that we use mean what they say they mean. Like we're not hiding the ball. So when we say things like a realistic job preview, we mean what a normal person thinks of what a realistic job preview is. So you can start there to say, okay, I can, be a little bit more focused on the content because I don't have to go around defining each of these terms. And maybe there is some jingle jangle, but nobody cares. Nobody cares about kind of the specific construct. They need to get to the result. That's the second part is you got to lead with the impact statement up front. You got to make it very simple in terms of what do I actually get out of this? What's in it for me? And what do you want me to do? I am maybe in a different situation because I'm within the Department of War. And so when I get invited to a conversation, I have a real big structural advantage. And that's that when a general officer or a person with SES comes and asks you to come speak, they already know that you are the expert or you wouldn't have been invited in the first place. So you don't have to spend a whole lot of time justifying your credentials. Be like, oh, I went to a top 4 program in IO psychology for my PhD at the University of South Florida. And you don't have to do any of that. Just get to the point. And then the other thing that I always like to remind people is like, again, that you are too conservative. You can definitely make it even simpler. So I all the time will do this. I stand in front of people with more salt and pepper in their hair than mine, who have been doing the things that they've been doing for a much longer time than probably I've been alive. And I have never once had one of them say, you're trying to insult my intelligence by making this too simple for me to understand. Not a single time has anybody ever said, could you make it more complicated? I'm feeling inferior at the moment. Never. I've never had that happen. And so I keep on pushing the envelope of making things simpler because a lot of times that is a really effective tool to just get to the point. Like the other thing I try to help, especially early career IOs, remember, and maybe again, this is specific to my experience, is that you're going to go into a room and you're going to have to get your foot in the door in like 2 minutes because you're going to be one of 5 different briefs that happen to this person. And you only get like this much attention before they're going to start, waxing off, or you'll watch them kind of fall back into their seat a little bit and they're already gone. So like get to the point. You got to think of less like results section and conclusions and more bumper stickers. So like what is like the 4 words, if you don't remember anything else from what I say, that I really want you to remember about this presentation? And that might be something, as simple as what I just said earlier, like you can go simpler. Right? You can go simpler. That's 4 words. If that's the only thing that you take away from this podcast, that would be good. And a lot of times that's all you're going to get too. So you might as well lean into it. And it's very counterintuitive for academics because, as I'm doing right now, we tend to be long-winded. So you probably will have to work at it. And then the other thing is like why that is effective. And I like to think of it like a little zip file, like that little bumper sticker. It exists and it has some file name associated with it that makes people remember, like, oh yeah, that's on my desktop. And Matt or AJ, they said those 4 words. And then what happens is they double click that little zip file in their mind and they go, oh yeah, and then that reminds me, they did mention that,
Ooh, I like
this
that.
thing about
Yeah.
correlations, or they did mention this thing. And then the cool thing about this, especially if you're in any business development context or you have to dance for your dinner, like a lot of us do, is that a lot of times they've forgotten important stuff that they wanted to remember, and then they call you back and they give you more money. And so it's a great
There
way
you
to
go.
do
Yeah.
all 3 of those things, to be remembered, to get your point across, and to leave them wanting in a way that you can continue the relationship.
One of the lessons that I learned early on after grad school and in some of the projects and roles that I was doing, I got some good feedback that has stuck with me, and I actually have it taped to the bottom of my monitor over there. Verbosity lives where meaning is formed. Succinctness lives where meaning is delivered. That was their nice way of saying, you're long-winded, Matt. Cut it down. I'm like, okay, and I cut it down. They're like, even more. And I was reminded, some people want to know how the watch is built. They want to know the intricacies, the details, the ins, the outs, the what if this happens, what if that. Others just want to know what time it is. And I love this idea of bumper stickers for compressing an idea. And then the practical action of that, putting it into the zip file with that same 4-letter, 5-letter acronym, where I immediately can see that and remember, oh yeah, AJ, that stood for whatever. And then when I open that up, I'm able to see a lot of those things, and I've heard them at least once or twice. I've seen them once or twice, but now that I'm going through that file again, it's more and more of it is I guess relanding. It's like I'm recalling it a little bit quicker. And so now going back to the person who did all of that data collection, data writing, and their intent was to communicate it out. It now has a stronger chance of being more practical and more applicable because it's easy for somebody to start making those immediate connections. So what are some of the bumper stickers that do you have? I mean, we talked about keep it simple. Do you have other acronyms? Because I may need to borrow some.
Well, not so much acronyms, but I definitely have some phrases that I'll bandy about because one thing, and again, I guess I'm solidly mid-career now. You see some of the same problems crop up, especially in a context because the leadership rotates out every 3 years. And so you spend 1 year educating folks, 1 year kind of getting them to buy in. And then by the time they actually get up and running, they PCS out. So but also I think kind of old wine and new skins and that type of thing always happens. So one thing that I will say at work a lot is that nobody accidentally joins the military. And it seems like such a simple thing, but it cuts through a lot of good ideas that people have had and they prop up and whatever else. And so there is this effect where you do see that in times of economic downturn, there's more folks who end up joining the military. And economists have demonstrated this time and time again. And then COVID happened, and we saw this giant spike in unemployment, and it didn't really change, the amount of people that wanted to join. And so I like to remind folks of that to say, like, people do make decisions, and they do, have it has a cascading effect towards their willingness to join. But that doesn't mean that overnight, they just kind of get bumped by the economy and the unemployment rate, kind of forces them down. They were riding skates and they happened to like accidentally fall into a military recruiter's office and perfectly sign their name and raise their right hand and put on the uniform. Like it doesn't happen like that. And so I think those type of things, I've just described a whole lot, right? The impacts of unemployment, economic factors on this big decision to join the military, right? But I started with nobody accidentally joins. And that just helps folks to remind themselves of, oh yeah, there is a process here. It is intentional. And we can influence those things in a way that makes our marketing work or helps our recruiters be more effective. But at the end of the day, it's ultimately a young person's decision to join. Like they have to make that decision. So I think helping people keep grounded that way is a good one. But no, I'm not really thinking of any other like work related ones off the top of my head.
Yeah. Still, that provides a solid framework, because even the way you were just talking about that there was a little bit of a bookend to it, that you start and end with something that's very simple, very easy, very memorable, and all of the detail that's in between gets, I don't want to say neatly packaged, but yeah, pretty much neatly packaged by those two bookends, where I can recall a lot more of that content that AJ's talked about, because if I can just recall or remember that phrase or that bumper sticker.
Yeah, and I think the way that we get taught that is tell them what you're going to tell them, tell them what you told them. Again, that is a great strategy for just keeping it simple, because again, no one will be offended and no one will accuse you of dumbing it down too much if you follow that prescription, because people like to get a preview of what they're learning. This is like just regular good learning theory, right? This is and then you get that period of instruction, and then you follow up to kind of reflect on that. In the military, we formally do this. We call it the bottom line up front. Just what is the conclusion that you want me to reach? And I think that this also really rubs against academic training in particular, right? So in academic training, you're taught, I write an introduction, and that tells you all of the different theory of where we are going to go and how we're going to chart our course. And then I write my method section. I tell you how we're actually going to drive down the road. And then we get into the results, and I tell you, all of my little hypotheses. I don't mean to belittle the hypothesis testing. I think it's useful and I use it every day. And then I get into my discussion of, hey, this is how we got here. And that's really what I needed to know up front. And that is really effective at talking to other technical IOs. And it is, it is effective for people who want to spend that cognitive effort to learn that. But most of our audiences are not. And that bottom line up front really does just cut through the chaff. I will also say that one of the things that has been kind of effective, and I know we're steering more into verbal communication rather than visual communication at this point, is when you start that bluff. Folks kind of chew on that conclusion, and if they want to, get into that of how you got there, they'll ask you, "Oh, what do you mean by that?" Or how did you come to this conclusion? Or I've even had people ask me about sample size, but it's pretty rare. Most of the time, they're like, "Actually, that does remind me of something, or something I had a previous experience with," or, "Hey, actually, this is what we're doing that's based on that already. How can you help us refine that to be more effective?" And I think that really, as long as you've got all of the other stuff of your, what would be your intro, methods, results, and discussion somewhere in that deck that you've maybe buried in the appendix or you were going to talk about, people just want to have that conversation. So I can't tell you how many briefs that I've started with my bluff slide that just has all of my key takeaway points, and I never leave it in like 90 minutes, because the stakeholder will ask us like, well, hold on, because I heard something else from this person. Can you kind of compare and contrast? Or, oh, actually, that does dovetail nicely with this new thing that we're doing. How do you think that can fit into what you've presented? They've already kind of absorbed your conclusion, internalized it, made it valuable for themselves, and they're just building on it. And so why would you want to, stop that momentum by rehashing how you got there? I love how you said it. You don't need to necessarily build the watch, just tell them the time. And then sometimes they'll just follow up to say, oh, and this is what we can do at this hour.
The audiences that we talk to when we're, as practitioners, when we're out there, it can be anything from the C-suite, the HR team, business partners, or prospective clients, all of that. And the idea or the notion of keeping it simple, of translating technical into non-technical, it's not done with any criticism of their ability to understand that. They're smart people. They're intelligent people. They are in those positions for a reason. They know their stuff really well. And I remember a conversation that I had with somebody. They said, by keeping it simple and to the point and very straightforward, you're respecting their time as well, because they've got their areas of expertise. They've got their task lists. They've got their 28 hours in a day that they need to get done. They're giving you time to introduce or to offer your your ideas, your perspective, your solution, whatever it might be, the simpler that you can keep it, the more practical for them to be able to say, and here's how this translates or ties into what I'm already doing, the more likely that that's actually going to happen. We've kind of gone into the more of the writing component, but even with the data visualizations, even with the graphs and the images and the pictures, I can't tell you the number of times that I've heard people within our field say, I spent so many hours making a beautiful graph, a beautiful picture of whatever the data was, and it was up on the slide deck for 30 seconds, or it was ignored, or somebody in the meeting was like, time out, I don't need to see that, just tell me X, Y, and Z. Like, we can invest a lot of time into making these beautiful images, these visualizations. And if we're not keeping all of these things that you and I are talking about, even with the written side, if we're not keeping those into consideration on that visual piece, if we're not making it easy, when I look at something, can I quickly understand what does that tell me and what is it trying to do, versus do I have, as the end user, do I have to try and decipher it? Do I have to understand all the complexities that you've put in? Because that's great, you know, all those pieces, but now it's so overly complicated that I'm going, this doesn't help me.
Yeah, and I'm actually glad that we have focused more on just kind of like the skills generally, right? Consulting skills, written skills, verbal skills, because all of what we described, we can just spend the rest of the time talking about how you apply that visually, which is kind of hard to do on a podcast, but it still can be done because it's all the same. So when you're trying to be very concise and keep it simple, stupid, right? You do the exact same thing with your visualizations as well. I think it's really easy to think you need to include that level of detail because a lot of times what we're trying to do looks a lot like what we've been trying to do in written or verbal form. Hey, I just need to tell you all of the things verbally and then you'll get it. Or, oh, I need to tell you all of the theory behind this, and then you'll be very impressed by how we came to this conclusion because it's based on standing on the shoulders of giants. Well, the same thing is true for your visuals as well. You can try to show this multi-level, multi-model, moderated, mediated, exploratory structural equation model. And just like the written or the verbal component, you can quickly overwhelm the audience. And I think one thing that I always tell my friends or my students when I'm talking about this is you got to learn to embrace the bar charts. That's probably the first thing that I'll say, and probably the one thing that if my students or anybody listening to this takes away is just good at bar charts. In fact, I was having a funny conversation with another one of my friends from grad school, and he works for it used to be a startup, and he's also really big into data visualization, and he knows some really cool stuff. We were talking about doing like interactivity and some animated things, and I love making cool dashboards, and this is all like pre-AI too. So you would spend an entire weekend trying to figure out how to get a few sliders going so that you could have some of those more interactive. He said, AJ, the worst thing in the world is I know all this stuff, and my boss goes, that's cute, make a bar chart. And that's cute, make a bar chart has stuck with me. Those 5 words have stuck with me for so long because it's so true.
Yeah.
And I think the reason why it works is there's a few different reasons. The first is that it works regardless of this thing called graph literacy. And so you can be a really sophisticated consumer of graphs and charts because you've consumed a lot of them. You have a good statistical understanding. Maybe you do even make a structural equation model, and you know what the different lines for endogenous and exogenous variables mean, and that's all well and good. But a lot of people aren't like that. And as much as my stakeholders are usually folks that they love dealing with numbers, they really do value and have over a decade now bought into evidence-based decision making, but they too would prefer just having something very simple because bar charts really reduce cognitive load. Another thing that people don't really think of now in visual communication, like with data visualization specialists and in computer science, they talk about cognitive load a lot. They talk about things like the data to ink ratio and trying to get as much data on the screen with as few inks, or in this case pixels, as possible. And so that is a really good way of kind of the first thing being the bar chart, but the second part being reducing some of that visual clutter is a great way to take advantage of some of these things. another principle, I think I actually learned this from Evan Steiner. He did a thing on data visualization for a white paper. And there's kind of this hierarchy of different ways that you can communicate visually. And the length of a line is the easiest way to understand, you know, some relationship. If one line is longer than the other, then I know that that's higher and that's more gooder than the other one that is less gooder because the line is shorter. It is that simple. It's like
Yeah.
almost like reptilian in our brain. It's very easy to understand. And so there's a reason why just use bar charts is so effective, and that's because it takes advantage of reduced cognitive load. You can really declutter them a lot, and you can make it really simple for folks to understand that, hey, I really want you to focus on this bar. This is the thing that I want to do. And that can be anything. That can be, validity coefficients. That can be, importantly, dollar signs. And folks, when you're talking to them as a stakeholder, typically do have a whole lot of graph literacy in dealing specifically with bar charts. And I think if you can take something complicated and get into a bar chart, that is my visual zip file. That's a way that I can translate all of this complicated, sophisticated, psychometrically rigid, IO psychology research and turn it into something that actually makes a good decision.
Two thoughts come to mind, and I'm not sure which direction I want to go. One of them, I'll throw out the statement, and then we'll see if there's a question that ends up coming with it. If not, we'll go the other direction. With you mentioned AI, and with a lot of the advancement in AI capabilities, I mean, it seems like every few weeks there's a new model that can do 6 to 10 times or more power than what the previous model could do. And sidestepping any of the, the questions around, the ethics or the validity of any of that information, is it hallucinating and whatnot, kind of sidestepping that for a moment. Even just the ability for some of the AI programs to do a lot of that visualization, what used to take somebody hours, or as you put it, weekends to put together a chart that has a slide, can be done in about 30 seconds with the right crafted prompt. And so I'm curious where sort of the next iteration of our field goes as we start to use those capabilities more. And what I mean by that is from the, what practitioners are doing, but also what we're teaching the students and the new practitioners that are emerging. Fast forwarding 5-10 years, is the ability to do some of that data visualization, is it in essence completely outsourced to AI, or is there still some, and then what does that look like? How complex can that get versus maybe that's an added line in your prompt? Keep it simple and it generates bar charts. I don't know. Any thoughts around how AI has impacted or is impacting any of the data visualization opportunities?
Yeah, absolutely. I think my students ask me this a lot because at the beginning of every semester, there's always that little blurb in the syllabus that says, all of your work must be your own original work. And they go, okay, but like, what about AI? So I very much, when it comes to my teaching, I follow the department's policies on those things, and I definitely follow them to the letter of the law. And what I tell my students is there's two things with AI. I 100% steer into it. I'm constantly tweaking with it. I think it's a tremendously valuable tool. And I have specific examples of, little shiny apps that I used to make in R that did take me a weekend. And like, Opus or Fable 5 can do it in like 5 minutes. And it looks really good. And also it doesn't use any R, and it's all like pure HTML. So you can just put it in a static website. That's pretty cool. But I know that is effective, and I know it works because I did all of the legwork on the front end, teaching myself those skills to be able to evaluate it. And it really is, I think that's the key. So the second part of this, I see AI as an assistant. I see it as, I just read Ethan Mollick's book, Co-Intelligence. I think that's a great way to put it, because you're working side by side with something that can do things that you can't do very well, and it can't do things that you do very well. And so, a good example of this, I'll go through all three. I'll go through written and verbal and data visualization of how I kind of use AI. But the written piece is, man, the worst thing in the world for me is when there's just a blank page in Microsoft Word and there's that cursor just staring back at me. just can't even get started. I'm just overwhelmed by how much potential there is there. But if I have an outline to work off of, or if I've got something that AI has slopped out, Tammy Allen over at USF used to tell us that all the time. She goes, just slop it out. Just get it on paper, and then at least it is written down, and then you can work from there. It doesn't have to be perfect. And I think
I've started off with a paragraph that I know I will delete. I'll start off with something like, this is garbage and I don't know where to start, but what I'm really trying to write about is blah, blah, blah. And before I know it, I've started kind of getting into something, and I can delete the first 5 sentences because I'm like, yeah, those were absolutely throwaways, but it was something that got thoughts going. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you there, but
No,
I love that.
that's
Yeah, it's like slop. Yeah.
yeah.
Intentionally
And
starting with
so
slop.
we even call it that too. We say like AI slop, right? So if you're already slopping it out, and if you're not, you should be, because then you at least have it written down. Then just use the machine to do that. And then, oh yeah, that's actually terrible, and you can rewrite it. But what I tell my students is you have to know how to rewrite it. Because if you just take what is given to you, one, you don't have the skill set to evaluate it. And then two, you can very easily be replaced by somebody else who just accepts what the AI has given to them. So no, you still need that skill. And then I use it for the verbal component too, right? So sometimes I will have a thought and it's not very well articulated, and I'll send it down to AI and it'll kind of restate it. Or a really good example of this is, I think, I will want to be understood at work, and I know I want to say something that former Marine infantryman AJ would just formulate a knife hand and yell at somebody, make it happen. And then I'm like, hey, maybe I could not say that, and I could use AI to help me figure out how I could say this more articulately. I think the running joke online has been like, what's the professional way to say, like, read the damn email? And then it just spits out like, as stated previously. Like, that's a really good example.
Yeah.
And then visually, it's the same exact story. So yeah, it's really good at writing code, but it writes like currently really bad code. And again, not bad in the sense that it doesn't function, but it sometimes does not follow best practices, because a lot of times what it's trained on isn't necessarily particularly like the best practice, and it can teach you the wrong things. So for somebody like me who learned it the hard way by actually like writing that app, in a weekend type thing, I know kind of what works and what needs to be refactored, and et cetera, et cetera. And so it's easy for me to evaluate the code just as I did the written communication, because it's the exact same thing. It's just that you're using human language when you're talking about something that's written, and then you're talking to computer language when you're trying to evaluate the code. But the skill set is the same. The skill set of knowing the foundations, knowing the syntactic or grammar rules so that you write appropriately, or knowing the programmatic syntax and grammar rules for R, for example. It is the same evaluation. And so that's what I tell my students is, yep, you could very easily fall into that trap of, I'm just going to use whatever it puts out, but you're not actually learning anything. And then for any professional, I think any professional is very focused on trying to make themselves better. That's probably why they're listening to this podcast in the first place, is they want tips and tricks on how they can improve. You're not going to do that if you're, farming out your thinking to something else that's doing it for you.
Yeah. Yeah. The skill can be lost. And if you're not, even if you are outsourcing the capability or the task, being able to have the skill and the knowledge to understand what it actually was doing allows you to, you're still engaged in the content, you're still engaged in delivery, and you're able to verify it that, yeah, what I'm putting together and putting and sending out I still have a relevant role in this translation, even if the task is being done here. Am I able to back it up, basically? So one of the other things we had talked about looking or kind of exploring a little bit was around some common language. So benchmarks that can make, effective size, common language effect sizes, benchmarks, Bosco. Let's talk about that a little bit. So you referenced, what do benchmarks tell us, and why are they more useful than like a raw correlation?
100%. So yeah, if the first tip is use bar charts, the second part is get good at communicating relationships to people who don't understand correlation coefficients. Now, IOs, we really do, right? We speak in correlation matrices. It's what you typically leave up on the screen for like the longest part of your job talk if you're an academic. But they're not really intuitive beyond kind of the most simple interpretation that like you teach to undergrads, right? Like we all kind of know the context around correlations, right? Oh, they can be positive or negative. They range between 0 and 1. And those are all great things. And Matt, if I tell you that something has a relationship with job performance of 0.4 to 0.5, and you like it, you and I are going to go retire because it's $1 million idea that increments above those things that are 0.3, right? Like we all know all that context.
Yeah.
But for somebody who doesn't speak correlations like we do, they're going to see a number there, and maybe they are as familiar with them as we are, but it's not all that valuable. My boss, I love the way he says this, because he says that's interesting but not compelling. And I think the goal is to make it compelling, to say, hey, I've already got the statistical background that I know this works. When it comes to, no joke, a selection decision, if I've got something that is a correlation of that 0.4 to 0.5, I'm going to make a lot more better selection decisions than somebody who has something less than that. And a lot of times we're talking about stuff that's less than that. So at the end of the day, we are going to be making more right decisions. We're going to be saving the organization money. I also try to think more about false positives these days too. So like, we're not going to put a person in a role that they wouldn't otherwise be capable in because we flag them as successful, but they actually aren't that successful. And I think that human element matters too. But all of what I would just describe to you is stuff that is compelling, right? Like that false positive example. Everybody's got some sort of example in any organization that they've worked in. I love to give the example of, because everybody's had this experience. Anybody who's ever had a professional job has had this experience where, you've got a vacancy in your organization and your boss comes up to you and says, Matt, you're not going to believe this. I just finished this interview with this guy or gal, and they're going to be a perfect fit. Like they hit all of the notes of what you want, and they're really personable, and they were funny, and they're going to fit right in this like specific deficiency that we have, and they actually have like, so maybe it's like, and they have military experience too, so like they can do all of the things, and they've got this experience, and they're going to be great. And then the person joins your organization and they're a turd. And that happens every single job is, especially like, I feel like there's like, the more you hype people, the more they turn out to like have inflated expectations.
The bar gets really high. Yeah,
exactly. But that's all still validity. This is still all communicating validation evidence. So one of the things that I think, if I could kind of go back to the numbers for a second, is to say we all were taught Cohen's conventions for what is a small, medium, large effect size, and everybody kind of uses those in discussion. And just like we were talking about for that $1 million idea that you and I got retired off of, Matt, we know that those numbers have inherent meaning, but you do kind of have to make it a little bit more concrete. And Cohen even said this in 1988 when he wrote that paper. He said, like, these are just back of the napkin math. But since then, we've had some empirical analyses. You mentioned Bosco et al. 2015. That's one of my favorite papers to cite because Metabus did a gigantic, hey, what are the no joke, all of the correlations that we actually have? What would be a small, medium, large effect size? And one, unsurprisingly, it results in the most famous 2 words of any psychologist. It depends.
It depends.
If you're talking about attitudes with attitudes or attitudes and behaviors, there's different standards. But regardless, they're much lower than what Cohen's conventions are. But again, that while is more realistic, it's still just more interesting. It's not really compelling. And then what I think is much more compelling is when you can, like I gave you that much more relatable example with somebody who gets hired and then becomes a turd on the first day and just like doesn't do their job. We all have experiences like that. And I think there's a paper from Meyer et al. 2001, an American psychologist. And what they specify is a bunch of things that are very relatable that you can back convert into their effect sizes and use them in conversation in a way that helps to communicate how effective some of these things are. So in fact, a good example of this is Adam Grant in his first book, Give and Take, talks about he is communicating an effect size, and he says that's as strong as the relationship between smoking and lung cancer. And that is such a good little tool to help illustrate that. And so if you wanted to show that visually, or you just wanted to verbally communicate it, that is a great way. There's a couple out there. I always tell folks, go read the Meyer paper because I never remember off the top of my head. But there's some in there that are in the range of like the effectiveness of antihistamines on sneezing and height and weight. Usually our coefficients are somewhere in that range, and so you can use some of those things. The relationship between height and weight, I think, is like effectively a Cohen's d of like 0.5 or 0.8, somewhere in that range, to be a large one. Those type of things are relatable to people because they intuit that, right? Say, oh, like I know when taller people are heavier. And so that's really cool. Now, I will say two things with this. First, 100% we've given up on the whole not making causal inference because a lot of those are causal. So you have to get comfortable with that. Now, there are some examples in the Meyer paper where they do have non-causal attribution, and the height and weight one, I think it could be argued whether or not that's actually causal, right? It's up for debate, but I think in terms of the actual discussion that you're having with a non-technical audience, you've made it relatable. So yeah, there's common language effect sizes, there's binomial effect size displays, there's icon arrays. A couple papers by Zhang from 2018 and I believe 2021 really do a good job of spelling this out in comparison. I think the 2018 paper, they compared the binomial effect size display, expectancy charts, and like icon arrays, so like little pictures of people, and found like that one in particular was really effective at communicating validity to non-technical audiences. So highly recommend icon arrays. I think that's another thing outside of bar charts that I'm very willing to use in my day job. And then there was a follow-up paper in 2021 also by Zhang, where not only did it help folks kind of appreciate the validity coefficient, but they followed up with that, and I believe they actually found that people were more willing to buy into the effectiveness of their intervention. So they said that not only is this going to predict what we want, but also that predictor is valuable, that it is valuable in its own right. I think it was specifically like SAT or ACT scores, which if you know anything about that discussion, there's always some controversy about using standardized testing. And so sometimes you're even trying to overcome pre-existing notions towards that. So I think, how communicating effect sizes visually through icon arrays or using language that has a relatable example, like smoking and lung cancer, or the relationship between height and weight. Or a funny one I think that's actually pretty typical in selection contexts. I think it ends up being like a correlation of like 0.38 or something like that, is Viagra on male sexual performance. There's one that and that's really salient because everybody knows the ad. It's kind of a goofy one. I don't want to say sex sells, but it definitely sticks in people's mind. And then it actually ends up being kind of in that range of what you would expect a quality selection system to be in. And again, as long as you're comfortable with having those discussions in front of your stakeholders, I probably won't be using that in my day job. Those are really good tools for helping you kind of get your point across, both visually and verbally.
Yeah. All of this comes back to the main thesis or the main topic of what we started the conversation with around how to be more effective with communicating data, and whether that's written, whether that's visual, whether that's verbal, whatever that might be, keeping it simple, using the bar charts, using certain categories that, might sell a little bit more, sex sells or whatever, things that people can understand, people can relate to. You may even, and again, using that carefully in the right setting and with the right audience, that can also be something that if it is something that a statement like that you can make in a particular audience, it's got almost a little bit of a shock factor that people don't expect to hear that. And so whatever it is that you are communicating it has a higher likelihood of sticking. And again, using very carefully and very cautiously with that one, because that's not always going to be appropriate in all settings. But what it
Yeah,
comes
that one
down
works
to,
better for my students than it does the generals.
see, there you go. Yes, exactly. Knowing your audience. And, all of this, though, all these different ways to communicate the data, the work that we do in IO psychology, HR management is incredibly fascinating. There's rigor, there's validity behind it, there's evaluations, all these different things to really understand the science at play, the science that's involved. And when it stays in that complex academic language, when it stays in the very verbose written document, when it stays in that format, like you talked about earlier, we've got the introduction, we've got the methods, you lose the audience quickly, and the ability, the potential for the impact of the data that you have to actually make work better, to actually drive and empower change or initiatives or planning or whatever it might be. So all these different ways of integrating how to effectively communicate the data that we so deeply know and can research. All of it's important. All of it is fundamentally necessary. Otherwise, the question sort of kind of comes to mind, then why do the data? Why do all the research? Why do the studies and the research for it to just sit on a shelf and collect dust? If it's not actually being implemented, there's a big question mark and a big missed opportunity. And so that's where the part of that translation, part of that bridge to implementing it is everything that we've talked about today. Keeping it simple, keeping it where knowing what your audience is going to understand. How are they going to be able to recall this later? What are the ways to reduce those points of friction? And that isn't, again, because they're not capable, they're not smart, they're not intelligent. They're just in a different area of expertise. If you put me in a room with a bunch of engineers, there's a good chance that a lot of that terminology that they know in and out is going to go right over my head. And so being able to find ways to communicate the data that you have, the data that we gather on an ongoing basis, that's where, so much of what we talked about today, that's what I take away from it. That's what I hear is there's a number of ways to communicate it. Just continue to get better at it.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. I think, the other thought I was thinking when you're talking about there's practical value in what we do. You and I would be very good basic researchers. I'm sure that you and I could unpack the mechanisms of human behavior in a way that is very sophisticated. In fact, for my dissertation, I did a lot of work on the circumplex model and the ability of different global fit indices to detect the circumplex nature of specific data, and really valuable. I definitely think I could do a lot of that basic research, but a lot of what I think motivates IOs, and now that I've taught like several different cohorts of students over the years, is a lot of people are drawn to IO because they see like the practical application of what we do, and we don't get to do that, what you described of to do this research and then put it on the shelf, because then we would be out of a job. So I think there's like a little bit of ASA going on there, right? Where people are attracted to IO psychology because they are interested in people, but then they very quickly realize that IO is like the place to be to do something that is relevant to organizations and has practical meaning. And again, I go back to like the 2x2 matrix that we all live by. People want to make good decisions about people. They want to reject bad people from their organization, or stop, CWBs or other bad behavior. But then we do also care about those other false aspects too. Like we don't want to, have a false negative and bar somebody from a job that they would be otherwise effective. It's a high stakes setting. Like this is where people, get their meal ticket. And the same thing is true for the false negatives, or excuse me, for the false positives. Those are folks that are occupying a seat that would be, better occupied by somebody who is more effective. And it does them a disservice. It asks them to do things that they may or may not actually be capable of based on what we've made a prediction on, or, these things matter. And so I think communicating that effectively, going right back to the top of the hour, is to say, we have a responsibility to meet the audience where they are, because what we say matters and is valuable and can help people. And so if you are willing to do that type of work, I think you should also be willing to lean forward and to, continue to polish your skills, to, especially when it comes to visual communication or verbal communication, and to say, I will be even more willing to lean forward into the audience and meet them where they are at, because what I have to say matters. And it's very important that I be understood. And we can't just be artists dancing around and expecting other people to interpret it for us. We have to very clearly communicate what we intend, what we mean. And I think that's what makes us really effective.
Brilliantly said. Well said. And also, I love that you brought in the 2x2, another example of something that's just so simple. And we may try to get away from the 2x2s and get something very, intricate and detailed. And it just comes back to give me a very clear 2x2. AJ, this has been a fantastic conversation. I've absolutely enjoyed it. As we close out, where can people learn more about you and the work that you do? Follow some of the things that you are sharing out there.
Well, I would really love to connect with folks on LinkedIn. I'm just AJ Thurston there. I'm still on Twitter at AJ Thurston, and also my website, ajthurston.com. There are a few specific applications. I know that we talked a little bit more kind of introductory and intermediate for this discussion, but if you're an advanced user and you're like, I get this, I'm more of your peer, I've also got some resources for you. You can go to ajthurston.com/SFW. And I've got 3 different tools on expectancy charts, predicted probabilities for logistic regression, and dominance analysis. But I think the more advanced user would really find useful, because there's kind of code and practical application. And feel free to take advantage of those resources, visit my website, and continue to learn with me.
Awesome. We'll make sure to include links to all those in our show notes. AJ, thank you for a fantastic conversation. And looking forward to more.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Science for Work podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider sharing it or leaving a review. It might just be the opportunity that helps someone else discover evidence-based insights they can use in their work. For more research-backed resources, articles, and tools, or to get involved with the Science for Work community, visit us at ScienceForWork.com. A special thanks to our guest and to the entire Science for Work team. Science for Work is an independent, nonprofit foundation of evidence-based practitioners who want to make work better.